Thank you very much, Saloni, for that very kind introduction. And hello and welcome, friends, to this evening, at the end of which I just hope that neither Pratap nor me nor any of us who's here at the Quorum will be charged with sedition. And I only say that in half jest because, frankly, there is a stand-up comedian who for the last 3 weeks has been in jail for remarks that the police believes he was likely to make because of a previous engagement where he had allegedly mocked political leaders and Hindu deities. So the Indore police in their wisdom felt that should he make similar remarks, before he chooses to make it, we should arrest him. And he hasn't got bail, and we are 3 weeks into him being in prison. So we don't want to all become Munawar Faruqis. It's a very sad case, and I do hope that he is released as soon as possible. I do hope that we can today explore in a way the politics of dissent, the limits of free expression, and indeed the challenges that Indian constitutional democracy and secularism, among other issues, faces at the moment. We are entering Republic Day week, 72 years of the Republic, and therefore I can't think of a better occasion in a way to reflect at where we stand as we enter the 72nd year of the Republic than to have with us one of the country's foremost public intellectuals, an outstanding writer and columnist and very fine mind as our Sherpa in a way for this evening, Professor Pratap Bhanu Mehta. Thank you very much, Pratap, for being here. Defense of dissent is how the Quorum has shaped our talk today. And in one of his recent articles, Justice Madan Lokur writes, Pratap, dissent and disagreement are slowly being turned into sedition. Sedition is being slowly turned into an offense under the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, and an offense under the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act will be soon turned into a national security issue, inviting the frightening prospect of an invocation of the draconian preventive detention law. Do you believe this is an exaggeration, or do you believe that we actually are in a situation where the right to dissent is no longer a right and could well lead you to be put in prison like Munawar Faruqi has been, the cartoonist?
First of all, thank you to the Quorum Club for organizing this, and thanks Rajdeep, as always, for your generosity. I think there are two ways of thinking about this, and there's one which I just want to mention because when we begin these discussions, we almost always begin with, but didn't this happen before as well, right? And the sad truth is that if you look at it in purely legal terms, right? This government has not had to invent any new laws to suppress dissent. UAPA is part of a long history of anti-terrorism laws, prevention of terrorism laws. One of the biggest scandals of Indian constitutionalism is that the law on sedition remained in the books. One of the biggest scandals of Indian constitutionalism is that Section 295 of the IPC, which supposedly regulates offenses against religion, has been variously interpreted by courts to always curb freedom of expression. So I want to make it clear that purely at a level of constitutional doctrine, there is still a lot of continuity in what the state is doing. But having said that, what is different about this moment? India's had previous bouts of authoritarianism, not just during the emergency, but at the margins, even democratically elected governments act in authoritarian ways in particular states. Think of, for example, the anti-nuclear agitation in Tamil Nadu, where the state freely used sedition laws, right? Almost 400 sedition cases. The Indian state has also occasionally acted communally, right? Where particular groups are being targeted for who they are. This is arguably the first time where both authoritarianism and communalism are combining in a new and deep form. Emergency was authoritarianism, but not quite communalism in this way, at least at a national level. So that's one thing that's very distinctive, right? Because it has huge ramifications. The second thing that is distinctive is, so one of the things I teach is constitutional law. For my sins, I edited the Oxford Handbook for the Indian Constitution. And I have to say, when I enter a constitutional law class these days, I cannot tell my students with a straight face what the Indian Constitution is and what protections it will give you. Rajdeep, you mentioned Munawar Farooqi. There are a couple of high courts that are exceptions, but can any of us now count on a court protecting your habeas corpus protection, which is the absolute cornerstone of any civilized society, right? Habeas corpus gone. Federalism, the Constitution's division of powers between center, state, concurrent lists, absolutely meaningless now constitutionally. Okay? You can just go down the list of every single constitution. It's almost like, with the connivance of the Supreme Court, the Constitution has been put in abeyance. It will be invoked when convenient, but it's not going to give you the protections you expect of it. Two other quick points in this. What also makes this moment distinctive is it's difficult to remember a time when the government had invested so much in controlling the information order as deeply and as totally as it can. Print media, maybe a little bit of exception. Social media, on and off, although even there's a lot of manipulation going on. But Rajdeep knows this better. Certainly television media, certainly large sections of the vernacular press. I mean, the Hindi newspapers are becoming unreadable these days, right? And an alliance of state and capital that is invested in controlling the information order so that what used to be, I mean, governments always called dissenters anti-national, but they never, in a sense, had the power, right? Or we could count on the fact that there would be some kind of counter-resistance, right, to that claim. That control on the information order is, in a sense, deep and total. And the last and final thing is, let's make no two ways about it. Our Constitution's greatest beauty was to say, unburden us in our public life as far as possible of God and identity. Not because these are not important, but precisely because these are important, our Constitution said, you should be free to choose it whichever way you want. We are now on the pathway to being a majoritarian nation. If we already are one, I'm trying to be polite. And globally it is true that any nation that gets afflicted by the politics of majoritarianism, white supremacy in the US, you already saw how close even that established democracy came, right? This combination of elements, Rajdeep, to my mind makes our liberties precarious in ways that have no precedent, faults of previous governments notwithstanding.
You've thrown up a number of issues, and we'll come to each of them one by one. You speak about majoritarianism, and it's interesting because only yesterday I did this mood of the nation polls, an exercise that troubles me because I don't know why we should be reflecting the mood of the nation of 1.3 billion people so casually at times. But it appears, for example, that the poll, one of the findings of the poll, and polls have to be at one level also taken seriously, suggested that 58% felt that there needed to be a law on interfaith marriages. And almost an equal number felt that Hindu and Muslim marriages was against Indian culture. So in a sense, the government could well turn around and say, look, this is the will of the people. When, for example, one may believe that the laws that are being brought in to control this so-called love jihad are against the constitution, are against constitutional morality, the government will turn around, look at these numbers and say, look, but a majority of the people of this country want a law that controls interfaith marriage. This is the will of the people. So what you may call majoritarianism or I may call majoritarianism and anti-constitution is being justified in the name of the majority. How do you see that? Is this again a reflection of the changing times where governments don't stand by the constitution, but in a sense stand by what they perceive to be the will of the people?
This is a very important question. So Rajdeep, it's true that in any society, if you look at any constitutional culture, right, there's always a gap between that constitutional aspiration and the realities of that society. And in most functioning societies, we often say that the constitution and society meet each other halfway, right? I mean, that's. Now, let's face it. I mean, I watched your poll last night, and I was trying to sort of decode it. Trying to put aside my skepticism about the polling, the nature of the polling. Or let's put that aside for a moment. But let's face it. India has been a conservative society. Still remains in many aspects conservative society. Our model of toleration was broadly a segmented model, right? Each community has its own place, so long as they stay in their place, right? We can sort of, in a sense, get along, right? Whenever the possibility has opened up of, let's say, mixing, mobility, and marriage is obviously the most kind of critical, personal point, progress has always been slow, not just on interreligious marriages, but frankly, the rate of intercaste marriages is still relatively low. So there's no question that India, in its sociological configuration, is still quite conservative. What is different about this moment? And the constitutional promise was that, look, these are personal choices. It is true that some families will not want to encourage interfaith marriage or look. But this is for society to solve at its own level, each family in its own way, each individual in its own way. Nothing was prohibiting you or nobody was forcing you to kind of go into interfaith marriages. What is different about this moment is that now we are saying that conservatism with a small c will be allied to the full might of state power, right? Which is what makes this, in a sense, different and dangerous. All our founders knew social change is incredibly complicated. I mean, these are the most personal aspects of our life. And the classic symptom of a deep authoritarian, almost fascist project is when that small c gets aligned with. We have no compunction using state power to prevent people who might have different views than us. So my family might not want interfaith marriages. That's fine, that's your choice. But the idea that you will use state power, that's very distant. And that is a product of the particular ideological configuration we have. That's not just a natural, because natural conservatives often don't like the state interfering in these things.
Because state power, in a sense, as you said at the outset, has always existed. There has always been an attempt, for example, to curb, what we see as free expression or individual freedoms. That's always existed. It now seems to have reached the point, though, where it's got normalized. It's almost as if it's normal now to, Tandav is released. Some person, I saw it, I found it pretty bad, actually.
I agree.
I was looking forward to a classic sort of Indian house of cards, but it didn't seem to work. And then suddenly I read next morning in the paper that some group has objected to the fact that it is anti-Hindu. Next thing I know, the UP police has gone all the way from Lucknow, as if they've got nothing else to do, to go and question the director at his home in Mumbai. Then I hear that people have sort of surrounded Saif Ali Khan's house and, want an apology. I just wonder whether all of this has got normalized or in a sense has got mainstreamed, or dare I say that that the mob has been empowered in a sense by the fact that the state itself is either an accomplice or in some way is part of this project of controlling people's choices.
So, Rajiv, I think that's absolutely right, but I think there are a couple of deeper undercurrents on this freedom of expression thing, which I think we need to confront squarely, right? So one of the tragedies of modern India is that the freedom of expression debates have always caught up in the politics of competitive religious communalism, right? You prohibited satanic verses, therefore, now you have to prohibit a book on Basveshwar, right? It's been part of, in a sense, that communal balancing act. And that has, by the way, been true since the 1930s. If you look at the history of the, Section 295 of the Penal Code. And one of the, lessons from that history is pretty much everybody wants to use the freedom of expression law as a way of asserting a communal identity. In fact, one of the interesting things about it, most of these people aren't even interested in real censorship, because one of the paradoxes of the modern age is you actually draw often attention to the thing. More people probably watch Tandav that night than they might otherwise have. In fact, there's almost a kind of performative, you call attention to something by asking for its censorship. So the purpose here, and what makes it tricky, is not classic censorship, although it will end up in that. The purpose here is to continually keep the communal pot boiling, right? Look, you didn't object to something on Lord Shiva being depicted. Oh, but what about Muhammad, right? And it's that alliance of censorship and communalism. Because look, if it were just about the boundaries of free expression, you could come to reasonable solutions. But nobody in this debate is interested in free expression. What they are interested in is how can we make this a pretext to go attack Saif Ali Khan, to remind you his kid is named Taimur or whatever. It's the fact that free expression it's a pretext, right? That makes it all the more poisonous and hard to contain.
As you said, there is this sort of almost a new alliance in a way that is being created between state power, between these forces of communalism, which sort of make it much more dangerous than it ever was. I just want to understand why you believe the courts have been so willing to allow this alliance, in a sense, to get strengthened and trample over the rights which the court is supposed to defend. You mentioned at the very outset habeas corpus. The fact that Kashmiris or Kashmir politicians spent months in jail without any redress of habeas corpus, the fact that you've got activists and indeed scholars like Sudha Bhardwaj who spent the last couple of years being denied bail, the fact that you've got to apply for a couple of, Father Stan Swami, an 83-year-old, has to apply for a straw sipper from the jail authorities, even as television anchors are given bail almost instantly, and the court will even meet during vacations. One of the good things out of the Arnab Goswami case is, at least as a TV anchor, I have a precedent now. If I'm arrested, to say, you let him off within 24 hours, what about me? You don't grant the same privilege today to stand-up comedians. You don't grant the same privilege, and more dangerously so, to politicians who've been kept in jail for months on end without any redress. Why do you believe that the court has been so selective, dare I say, or has been a victim of partisanship, or not victim, but part of this partisan political culture that has been created in this country?
Oh,
you use the word judicial barbarism, which got you into trouble, I know, in a piece in November.
Look, it's hard to diagnose, but I think two things about the courts. And I think, to be fair, there are still good judges, particularly at the High Court level, even in a state like UP,
Yeah,
that are
you're
actually
seeing the Allahabad High
passing-
Court, yes.
Allahabad High Court has passed some sort of tremendous orders, right? I think with the Supreme Court in particular, and because that, in a sense, what sets the culture. So look, I mean, this is stuff journalists know more about. There's always speculation about, are Indian elites now so vulnerable with skeletons in their closet that the government doesn't even have to do anything overtly for them to bend, right? That's said about Indian capital. And these norms will have to be set by the elite because they are the privileged, they are the most powerful, but they are the ones who are succumbing the fastest, right? So there's probably an element of that at the margins in some cases. I think the second thing we should not underestimate, and we've seen this even, in parts of the US, certainly other countries that are going through similar experiences like India, Hungary, Poland, is that, there is a kind of greater acceptance and normalization of Hindutva amongst elite circles, right? And I don't think we should discount that possibility, right? That for a variety of reasons, large and influential sections of India's elite, capital, bureaucracy, frankly, large part of academia now increasingly, right, have thrown in their lot with this ideology. I actually think some of what the Supreme Court is doing, it is doing out of conviction. And that's what worries me. It's not pure opportunism. Because, with pure opportunism, fine, you give the government a couple of key victories it wants. The ideological articulation, take the farmers' movement. Why does the Supreme Court have to accept an affidavit from the Attorney General on, are there Khalistanis there? It has no bearing on the legal matter, right? The only purpose is to legitimize a particular ideological construction in a sense of what the state is. And that's what I think worries me, that I think that penetration is far deeper than, we are so used to be cynical that we can't actually believe people act out of conviction. Unfortunately, people do act out of dangerous convictions.
No, it's interesting you say that because that is exactly what I think about television newsrooms. When people say, newsrooms are normalizing this kind of communal narrative, I say that's because they believe it. There is a belief system today, and there are rewards to be had. Particularly, if today in the age of Hindutva, you probably want to be an editor, you've got to sort of fall in line. You've got to be a cheerleader of these forces. And it's not just opportunism anymore. It's actually out of conviction. And you're right. Just as you're worried about judges, I am worried about editors, if any exist anymore. Who will stand up in a way and question those in power. But you mentioned the elites, and you sort of referred to the judiciary as, in a way, part of the elites. Why do you think that the elites have succumbed so easily? Did this always exist in a sense, somewhere subliminally below the surface? And in a way, the rise of Hindutva or Moditva, as I call it, has normalized this, given it a certain legitimacy, empowered the elites to talk the language that once Bal Thackeray told me, I am the loudspeaker of popular grievances, things that people won't say, that throw the Mumbai Muslims who support Pakistan must be thrown out. Today, if Bal Thackeray was around, he no longer needs to, there are Bal Thackerays all over. What was said in closets is now said in the open. Do you see that as, why do you think that's happened in the last 20, 25 years?
So, look, at one level, if you take a longer historical view, this argument and debate has been pretty much around since the 1920s, right? And in a way, partition was one kind of product of that. And let's not forget that Indian constitutionalism was born in that prior failure. In class, I often ask students to speculate on a kind of counterfactual. If the RSS had not assassinated Gandhi, right, would the right wing have been so much more powerful in the 1950s to openly challenge and delegitimize Nehru? maybe we sort of got that cover for 15, 20 years, which is, by the way, true of most constitutional transitions in the world. They succumb to this kind of left-right division, right? And to be fair, there are still a lot of sort of, in a sense, unresolved issues out of that legacy of the 1920s and 30s. I mean, I think what we did with our constitutional settlement in 1950 was provide a kind of modus vivendi, right? Let's not go back to the fundamental issues of, should Article 1421 apply to Common Civil Code, status of Kashmir. We, in a sense, we negotiated them simply by ignoring them and putting them in abeyance. And I think one of the things I think all those who are not Hindutva, I think, have to honestly ask, which is, why is that even on issues like gender, the BJP occupies a much more progressive space than, let's say, the Congress did under Rajiv Gandhi or 1980s, right? So there is, in a sense, that I think underlying basis. I think the two things that changed in the last 10, 15 years, one, as you Rajdeep rightly said, is look, all political leaders, mature political leaders, understand that their societies have these dark subterranean impulses. And the job of a leader is, in a sense, to draw the red lines. That's probably the only serious job of a leader. This is acceptable, this is not acceptable. In every right-wing authoritarian regime, once the leader dog whistles or gives a signal, that's what Trump did, right? I mean, it's not that white supremacy did not exist or that he had to invent it or violence did not exist in American culture. But once the top of the political leadership just dog whistled saying, it's okay, or as you put it, you might even be rewarded for this, right? You're changing the incentives in a sense completely. The second thing that I think happened, which is probably more closer to our time, is, post 2009, once the financial crisis hit, once there was this moment of loss of confidence about that India growth story, right? Because that had sublimated our nationalism in a different way. We've got 8% growth. India is arriving on the world stage. We are getting the nuclear deal we want. That entire discourse of nationalism. Once that story began to falter, right, Indian elites began to realize two things. One, that you will probably need a stronger state and a more repressive state to keep social contestation at bay. They actually became, in a sense, more fearful, right? And a lot of that I think that allegiance comes from that sense of fear. We all want dissent, Rajdeep, in the abstract, but nobody in the Indian elite seriously wants social contestation. And they'd rather have the state. I mean, let's face it, even the farmers' movement, which is this extraordinary democratic movement, has actually very little support outside of the particular constituency it addresses. The anti-CAA movement, right, against odds, a movement of courage, did not become other than amongst college students, a few small constituencies, a movement to which any Indian elites were joining, because they're afraid.
So do you think it's fear in a way that is sort of preventing people from sort of expressing themselves more freely? Is it the fear factor, what you mentioned, the combination of sort of an authoritarian state with communal politics that creates this toxic mix? Is it fear, or do they just sense that maybe, as some analysts have suggested, this is India's Hindutva moment, and therefore those who in a way challenge that in any form, whether it's farmers who are seen to challenge the state, whether it is students who are seen to challenge the rule, they immediately are branded anti-national. The moment you capture the nationalist space, and I am branded anti-national for questioning the state, then the space for me to dissent shrinks. So is it fear, or is it the clever, the almost ingenious manner in which nationalism today has been captured or monopolized by the state?
I mean, as we used to joke in school in multiple choice questions, right? Probably the shortest answer is all of the above.
All of the above.
Right? I mean, but with one other, I think, thing, one of the things we could always count on in Indian society, which was both from a particular perspective of strength and another perspective of weakness, was that there was a natural social fragmentation of power, right? In the 80s, 90s, when you used to write those wonderful things in Times of India. Remember, the standard narratives used to be Mandal will cut Mandir, right? Or region or language will prevent the consolidation of power, right? Individually, none of those things might be desirable, but the sheer fragmentation of social power, we always used to think that means Indian politics will remain broadly centrist, because there are too many cross-cutting cleavages for any single force to dominate. I think one of the more profound shifts that has happened is that social base has changed considerably. So think of caste politics, for example. Now, you've written insightfully, caste, of course, still matters for politics. Even the BJP does very complicated electoral and social engineering. But think of the difference between caste politics now and caste politics 10 years ago. 10 years ago, the logic of caste politics was agglomeration, right? When the BSP rose to power in UP, it says we will take a lot of these jatis, give them a new political identity, make it a social force that is a kind of counterbalance. Now in every state, the logic of caste politics is de-agglomeration. There's greater inequality amongst the SCs. The debate over reservations is EBCs, there's also more individualization. So that natural social base, for good or for ill, right, that would act as a social check, in a sense no longer exists. Region. So long as the BJP does not touch the language question, the region thing has been sort of taken off the agenda, right? That was the two big accommodations BJP made. So and one of the reasons I think the liberals and the left and everybody else got lazy in India was we were in grip of a sociological determinism. India is too complex, too divided, it can never be centralized, right? You have to give this to Mr. Modi and Mr. Amit Shah. They realize that political identities are constantly created by political hard work. There is no natural sociological determinism that you can count on. Even now, when the Congress speaks, what does it say? We'll do a Dalit-Muslim alliance. I mean, Dalit politics has moved on, right? So that natural fragmentation of power means that there's no natural check and balance, which means that if you stand up against it, you don't know, is there a social force that will come and protect you?
No, I was fascinated when I went to cover the farmer protest that, while it was incredible to see the sheer audacity with which, the farmers were willing to take on, in a sense, this all-powerful state, and in winter, in freezing temperatures, they're out there. When I asked them, who will you vote for? Sir, wo sochenge. It's not as if they are sort of anti-Modi in any way. A lot of the farmer protests are about, the misuse of state power. They feel that they've been taken for granted. So even their dissent, in a sense, is a dissent which is within a certain limitation. In Punjab, it is now increasingly sort of being connected to Sikh identity. And I think that's where the government should worry. That, the Sikhs feel as a community today that these farm laws somewhere strike against the community and the sense of what, their identity as a agrarian community is, which is why it's cutting across all divides in Punjab. But, you get the sense that even when dissent does take place, it takes place within certain confines. It's not going to become a mass movement of a kind of, people keep asking me, why aren't farmers protesting across India? And I just wonder whether maybe the nature of these protests have also now changed and transformed. So, likewise with the anti-CA protests, which were for a while branded as Muslim protests.
Yeah. Well, no, Rajdeep, you're right. I mean, of course, the nature of protests, the choreography of protests has changed. I mean, in a sense, even the politics of protests has become more nationalized. I think what protest movements find it difficult to figure out now, and I think even in Punjab, as we were discussing, I think you were going to have this dilemma, is what's the political channel of transmission and articulation? So fine, we as a group protest. Now typically what would happen is there would be an opposition party that would either use these protests, or a protest would use an opposition party as a kind of bargaining chip against government. We'll vote for these guys if you don't do this for us, right? Now, the total self-destruction of that opposition means all of us are in this genuine dilemma, okay, what's the political channel in which we'll be articulated? Because at the end of the day, right, if you have a protest, tomorrow, let's say the government accedes to the demands, we just go back to status quo ante. The change always requires some threat of a possible political change. If farmers are upset, will they say, we are never going to vote for X party? Now the problem, as you know, even Punjab is, my own reading is that I think the Congress is going to suffer as much as the BJP from these protests, because they don't see that political articulation linked.
In a sense, where I'm coming from is that as we look into the 72nd year of our republic, the constitution founders were driven by idealism. Today, India is increasingly, seemingly driven by sort of this chilling pragmatism. How do I win the next election? I don't think the founders of our constitution, the constitution makers, were looking at, how do you win the next election? So with vote bank politics, with every decision being taken through the prism of winning the next election, does that in a way undermine constitution values? Look at whether it is Article 370's abrogation, whether it is now, the building of a Ram Mandir. All of this seems to be with one eye of how do I consolidate my Hindutva vote bank.
No, I think, Rajdeep, to be fair, look, our founders were serious politicians, and if you go back to even the first limited franchise elections in the 1930s, some of these debates were coming to the fore, right? And let's be very clear, you shouldn't be in politics if you're not in the business of winning elections, okay? I think the difference, so to that extent, I would not blame this dispensation. I mean, there have been all kinds of weird electoral, in fact, we used to, have this term, remember, that we have lots of electoral secularists. No genuine, I can think of Charan Singh as a great example of a perfectly good electoral secularist who, in every other respect, would have been quite comfortable with this dispensation. I think the difference is what are the red lines and the limits that the political class as a whole decides we are not going to cross when we engage in this electoral contestation, right? Are you going to legitimize complete vigilantism and say, vigilantism is your path to power? Yesterday's Yogi Adityanath or tomorrow's Sadhvi Pragya, this is going to be the pathway to a political future, right? I think that culture has deeply and profoundly changed, right? I mean, in fact, I do wish the Congress actually took electoral politics seriously. You want the opposition to take that a bit more seriously. But it's the decimation of those lines which now has empowered the worst of our subterranean self, as it were. I think that's what's changed.
Because when a Yogi Adityanath becomes the chief minister of India's most populous state, I mean, what is the message being sent out? I mean, till the other day, he was a vigilante who was essentially leading these groups on issues like love jihad. If an individual like that is rewarded with becoming the Chief Minister of India's populist state, the message right down the line seems to be that that is the way forward. I mean, is that in a sense, therefore, that our political class now believes that cynicism has to be taken to the point where, anything goes. That Yogi Adityanath is, his sort of rise, in a way, reflects both the failure to offer a sort of alternative, a credible alternative, but also the belief again that, this form of majoritarian politics is perfectly acceptable.
No, I think you're right. And it's a signal. And I think the puzzles, sometimes you ask, Modi supporters, let's say for argument's sake, right? Let's grant the fact that there's no question that Mr. Modi has extraordinary political skills and energy. It's, just from a purely political point of view, you have to acknowledge that fact. But one of the things even Mr. Modi supporters should worry about is, what do you think the structure of the BJP will look like 10 years from now, right? What is going to be the nature and the character of that party, right? And the fact that there is such easy acceptance of all of this, I think signifies that there are more true believers. And in 10 years, people will even have forgotten that there were alternatives or alternative ways of imagining a constitutional culture for India. I think that amnesia will set in pretty quickly.
Because, you've got a situation now, if you were to do any story, for example, against Yogi Adityanath's government in Uttar Pradesh, first thing that is done, the police files an FIR. Yeah. I'm just wondering the role of the police in particular. They seem to be completely, there is, the sort of instruments of state tyranny, the enforcement directorate, which is essentially what I now call not a cage parrot, but a one-eyed vulture. It only seems to find people in the opposition who seem to have cases against them. In fact, if you switch from the opposition to the government, the case is dropped. So you've got the enforcement directorate, you've got the CBI, you've got the average police officer in a police thana who files these FIRs for a simple story that may be done against in Uttar Pradesh. You've got Nitish Kumar, who till a few years ago was being seen as a so-called secular hero, who now says if anything online is said against the government, you can be arrested. You've got Mamta Banerjee, who will arrest you for a Facebook post. You've got Bhupesh Baghel's government, which has also, used the police force to arrest anyone who's seen as a dissenter. This, the way the police is used, is there absolutely no check and balance that you see in the system to this sort of creeping authoritarianism?
No, Rajdeep, and you're very right to point out that in our discussion of the BJP, we must not forget the fact that this authoritarian, in fact, I think the BJP has actually copied a lot of the elements from the authoritarianism of state and regional parties, which it is kind of just lifted up to the national level.
Right? Just to intervene, I have no sympathy in a way for my friend Mr. Goswami for the kind of journalism he does. But I found it ridiculous that in a 2 or 3 year-old case, the Mumbai police suddenly lands up at 6:30 in the morning to his house to pick him up.
Right.
And the Shiv Sena seems to celebrate that moment.
No, absolutely. And they're the Shiv Sena, but even if you think of the old kind of Tamil Nadu politics, right, where populism in terms of distributing public-private goods, which this government is good at one level, right, that's its kind of economic strategy. Complete stranglehold over television channels. So I think these have been perfected, and that's one of the reasons you're not getting resistance. You can't point to a single state government and says, okay, that's the model. We would like to, on freedom of expression, is there a single chief minister you can throw your allegiance behind, right? But that's where I do think, Rajdeep, the role of elites, right? Because, and again, not to sort of beat or kind of sound like a broken record, but historically, in a way, the media and the judiciary. Think of the United States, right? Through this entire crisis, the two things that in the end saved this occasion was, one, there was still contestation with the media. You may not like the Washington Post, you may not, and they have their own partisanship, etc. But the fact of the matter is that media space remained open. And when it came to the crunch, the judiciary, including Trump appointees, delivered on every single case. All it would have taken was one judge in Georgia, right, to even delay, not even pass an order. And you could have had the country at the brink of a civil. That's, look, the police are directly under the executive. But when the most protected, and why we say the judges, because technically they're the more, what does a Supreme Court judge have to fear other than a possible, you would not get another commission of inquiry after retirement?
Yeah, he won't get a post-retirement job and he won't get a bungalow as a result to live in.
But, you might be better off actually not having that. But when the most privileged send a signal that even we aren't in a position just to do our basic duty, we are not asking heroics, right? Then think what that message of fear sends down the line. Same is, by the way, true of Indian capital, right? I mean, the important thing about, look, Silicon Valley, Wall Street, most of them were lined up behind Mr. Trump, and they're now sort of regretting it, right? But the signal that even an odd Bezos would send, whether you like his politics or not, right? That I have the liberty to speak my mind. If the most powerful can't send that signal, why do you expect, the SHO to actually stand up?
In fact, most industrialists give every budget 11 out of 10.
Right.
And I was privy to an occasion where a particular industrialist first at a function when the late Arun Jaitley was finance minister, said, "You are the best finance minister India has had since independence." Next year, Nirmala Sitharaman is the finance minister, again repeated it. "Madam, you are the best finance minister India has had since 1947. So I just wondered, this sycophantic culture, does that, this sort of chamchagiri, which is sort of so deeply embedded, dare I say, in the Indian elite in particular, is that one reason why we don't sort of, in a way, value dissenters or contrarian opinions often enough? Is there something about, is this culturally a problem that we have, that, this sort of Mai-Baap feudal culture leads us to sort of worship the Ukta Suraj? It could be Mr. Modi one day, it could have been, dare I say, a Congress leader a few years ago.
Look, I mean...
Are we a nation of dissenters, or are we a nation of simply people who just want to sort of ensure that they follow the leader?
I think my worry is that, look... there's an element of truth in what you're saying. Partly, of course, we also made certain institutional choices which make these things harder, the particular history of state-capital relation in India. But my worry at this moment is I don't think what we are seeing is the usual chamchagiri. Because one of the things about usual chamchagiri is that everybody nods and winks and knows that this is the game, right? It's that dramatic guy who comes and does shashtang in front of the leader. And, in a way, it had generated its own clarity, right? Everybody was role-playing, right? Now, if we are role-playing in a way in which we are actually internalizing what we are saying. And that, I think, is a much more dangerous turn than the historical chamchagiri we were used to.
No, I remember, since you mentioned America, there was this police officer, I think in Texas, who came on live television and sort of took on Donald Trump while he was president, not in his last days, but at the height of his presidency. Now, can you imagine any Indian police officer? Can you imagine, let's say, as you mentioned, Bezos could sort of challenge the estate. Can you expect the Ambani, Adanis, for example, to actually sort of question the government in this country?
They are the government.
Yeah, they are the government. Okay, is that because of the collusion, as you keep saying, of state and capital in this country? Is that because of the fact that in India we haven't created an insulation for a police officer who may want to tell his MLA or his minister that, sorry, I'm not going to sort of accept this. He'll be transferred out the next day. Do you believe it's a structural problem in that sense?
No, obviously, look, we have to go institution by institution, and with the police, certainly, there's a real institutional problem, which is the way its administrative structures are designed. There is basically no protection for an individual police officer from the executive persecuting them, right? But what is characteristic about our present moment, right, is that even institutions where you had the most insulation, right, RBI, Supreme Court, right, we always used to say these kind of independent regulatory institutions, the ones that have the most protection are actually, in a sense, succumbing the fastest. So it's not entirely just a matter of, in a sense, institutional design.
Couple of more points as we end. One is on, why is it that, for example, in the Indian context, we haven't really seen a movement like Black Lives Matter in the United States this summer get the kind of traction and saliency? Here when the anti-CA protests took place, and you mentioned that, they were sort of dubbed as Muslim protests in a way, rather than sort of see them as people sort of worried about whether we will have equal citizenship or not. Why do you think that isn't happening at the moment? Again, is civil society also so emasculated? Because Black Lives Matter seem to come through civil society.
No, Rajdeep, look, to be fair, we've also had a long history of protests. In a way, think of the almost all the anti-caste movements in South India. Maharashtra, right? It's in a sense a cradle of almost every kind of agitation that you can imagine, right? So I don't think the issue, in a sense, has been that we in a sense, haven't had a kind of history of the protest. And to be fair, I think one of the paradoxes is that, one of the things about our constitutional culture and the kind of the dreamy aspirations of Finder, that normatively we accepted everything good, right? So, in a sense, whereas one of the things about, the US story in a way, is the US Constitution was in part designed to, in a sense, exclude and designed to protect slavery, which is why it first took a civil war, post-Reconstruction, again with Jim Crow laws. So, one paradox we have is that movements require a focal point, right? They often succeed when you say, I want this law changed. Okay? That's a clear focal point. One of the very clever things we've done is we always preempt that focal point. Our laws are actually perfectly fine. There's no discrimination enshrined in the law. Our Voting Rights Act is particularly equal. We have actually strong reservation in affirmative action, right? The problem, in a sense, arises more at the moment of the daily practices of the state, right? How does the police force work? Now, the problem with that is that most people in India, in a sense, survive by trying to stay out of an interaction with the state, right? That's in a sense been our traditional historical, even migrant labor, for example, right? You would think with this catastrophic loss of income, there'd be some sort of revolt. And so it's not easy to provide those kinds of focal points where that focal point is enough to unite large numbers of people let's be very cynical about the CA protests. For 80%, 90% of society, didn't make a difference one way or the other, right? I think that focal point is often very difficult in a sense to find. I mean, the problems of collective action and so forth. But it's a matter, I mean, I can't believe that you can repress people for so long. So, who knows what that moment will be.
Two quotes that I wanted you to comment. One was Mohan Bhagwat, the RSS Supremo, who while launching a book on Mahatma Gandhi, and look at how India has changed, that he was launching a book there on Gandhi, says, if you are a Hindu, then you will be an automatic patriot. You may be an unconscious Hindu, you may need awakening, but a Hindu will never be anti-India. This definition again of patriotism, in a sense, how do you see? I mean, are we redefining patriotism, secularism, where Bhumi Pujans are performed, when a new parliament building is to be set up, or the Prime Minister overtly identifies himself with the Ram Mandir, the President decides, I'm going to fund the Ram Mandir. Have definitions changed of how we grew up to understand patriotism and secularism?
So look, Rajiv, I think we need to sort of distinguish between the kind of the core and the peripheral, right? And I think in Indian debates over secularism often, so, look, Joe Biden also went to church before inauguration. That's perfectly fine if somebody wants to do that. Where we went wrong and where we are in a sense accelerating the trend is the two core things about, in a sense, secularism is, look, what rights and standing you have as a citizen are not aligned to any particular identity that you might have. Now, what you do with identity is up to you. I mean, if you want to go to the temple or the mosque or the church, that's in a sense, that's perfect. And frankly, that's also part of the freedom secularism gives you, right? In our case, those acts which are public acts at one level, but they're public-private acts, right? Nothing turns on whether you do it or whether you don't do it. Those are now aligned to, in a sense, a systematic project that says, look, what rights and what standing, and that's what Mr. Bhagwat is saying, right? Tell me who you are, and I will tell you whether you are entitled to be a citizen of this country, right? To me, that's the core violation of secularism. Whether, Mr. Oaisi goes to the mosque or Mr. Modi wants to go to the mandir, that's, neither here nor there. The second thing, I think, which is the fundamental transformation is, Jawaharlal Nehru's, the greatest paragraph from the discovery of India. The book has several problematic stats, but the greatest paragraph is the one that said, look, India is a palimpsest. And one of the things we used to pride ourselves on is that literally every human tendency and every human culture has come and left its imprint on this palimpsest. It's a Hindu country, it's a Muslim country, it's a secular country, it's a Marxist country, it's a Naxal country, it's an Eastern power, it's a European Enlightenment power, it's an Asian values power, literally everything, right? I mean, it's an absolutely extraordinary, and the constitutional project would say, how can we live on equal terms despite these differences, right? Now the project is to say, no, India is a Hindu country. When Prime Minister Modi said, the consecration of Ayodhya, and trust me, in 10 years this is going to happen, that the day of the laying of that foundation stone of that temple is as important or even more important today than 15th August, right? That is telling you a particular story. Right? Those are his exact words, right? कि ये तो बहुत ज़्यादा बड़ा दिन है क्योंकि तो 1000 साल की गुलामी, right? That's the core of secularism that I think we are in the danger of losing.
In fact, it's interesting, in the Mood of the Nation poll, the biggest achievement of the government is seen as the building of the Ram Mandir, and the biggest failure is seen as the failure to provide jobs. But it seems that more people seem interested at that moment that, the mandir is being built, forget about jobs. But let me get 5-7 minutes of questions that people may have yes, sir. Go ahead.
Hello. Yeah, I think, can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. I think getting back to Mr. Mehta's, comments on media and judiciary, I think I also feel that between what's happening in the US and in India, I think the institutions like the media and the judiciary are, I think, also in collusion in India, unlike what is there in the US. Now, my question in this regard is, are we to now believe that we are well and truly a mobocracy? Why is the media and the judiciary, are they driven only by the executive for the decisions that they are taking, or are they fearful of the media? Have the BJP and the RSS, released a tiger, say in 2014, which is now running amok, and they are unable to cage it, or are they at all interested in caging it? So that's my question on, are we well and truly now a mobocracy?
I thought we had a CEO of Niti Aayog who said we have too much democracy in India, and seemed to suggest that was the problem. But this perception again that that the state is increasingly aligned to the mob, or the mob is aligned to the state. Is that again an exaggeration, you think, or do you think this is a reality now?
No, I mean, I think it is a reality. I mean, and in fact, there's a couple of, so one, as of course political opposition weakens and the usual channels of opposing government are no longer available, you would expect more street protests, because there's no other way of channeling dissent, right? And you're in this vicious circle that the more you see that protest, the more the government says we have a pretext to repress. Because look, they're not listening to what Parliament says, forgetting the fact that Parliament is no longer that arena of channeled contestation that, in a sense, we got. So it's in a sense that during the CA protest, by the way, right? They've done it much less with the farmers' protests, but the government thing was quite clear that this is a wonderful political opportunity for us to be able to say, look, there's a mob out on the street. At some point, people are going to get fed up of this, and then we find some pretext, right? So you're in that vicious circle. And the other part of that vicious circle is that the real mob, which is dangerous, which is empowered, right? When the UP government, for example, decides to put people in prison without trial, encounter, whatever, all of those things that happen. That mob, we now do not think of as a mob. We think of it as the normal, proper channel of the state, right? I mean, that's a really remarkable reversal in what's happening to the institutional configuration of democracy.
And I think that's where the government got the farmers' protests wrong. They thought they would treat it like they treated the CA protests and sort of dub the farmers in some way as Khalistanis, and I think, in a sense, there's a strong element of farmers' pride, which this government has just got horribly wrong. It's really boomeranged on them. Calling farmers Khalistanis has triggered such an angry reaction. So even those who were willing to negotiate would not negotiate in this atmosphere. But go ahead. Yes, the gentleman there first. Yes.
Good evening, Professor, and hello, Rajdeep. I want to talk about Tandav, the controversy surrounding this series. And I was personally offended by it. And it has nothing to do with the story and the acting and all those things, but absolute moronic, the word is moronic, representation of Anand Tandava. That's what exactly it is called. Now, let's change the pieces on the table over here. Tell me a single movie which has depicted Prophet Muhammad in a cartoonish way. As Shivji has been depicted again and again, and guess what? Quote unquote Muslim movie makers. I'm sorry, I'm being very blunt over here, but tell me about a single movie, in the recent past which shows Prophet Muhammad in a disdainful way or in a cartoonish way. I mean, there was a movie which was supposed to release in July, which was made in 2015, Messenger of God or something, Muhammad, which was stopped. And it has nothing to do with anything, which was a story. So obviously you gentlemen are much more learned, you have much more information. So let's talk about it. Give me a single movie which shows Prophet Muhammad in a disdainful manner. Whereas again and again, filmmakers, which happen to be quote unquote again Muslim, have shown Shivji in a cartoonish manner. I mean, what was the relevance of that stupid dance sequence? And then you have the protagonist who is named Shiva. Okay, good. That's like the, cream on the cake. And then again, he is involved with another, character who happens to be from another religion. And by the way, I like BJP and I don't like Modi ji. So let's talk about that. Thank you.
That's an interesting one.
That's an interesting one.
Yeah.
Because we were told the CSDS post-poll survey of 2019 shows 1 in every 3 people who voted for the BJP said they only voted because of Modi ji. If there was no Modi ji, they wouldn't have voted for the BJP. So you're an interesting sort of outlier. But yeah, go ahead, Pratap. Why don't you respond? Because I think that the gentleman there has, so in a way, sort of put forward an argument that is often,
absolutely,
that is often put forward.
Absolutely. So look, 2 things about it. And
let him respond, yeah.
So 2 things about it. My own personal position has always been, right, that in the modern world, so, there's nothing admirable about giving gratuitous offense, as you rightly said, right? But let's face it, in a modern interconnected world, there will always be somebody, right, who will, for whatever reason, choose to give this kind of gratuitous offense to all religions. Just hang, okay? Therefore, any free society, I actually firmly want at least the repeal of Section 295 of IPC. Okay, this should apply to, in a sense, all religions. And by the way, this has become, this competitive thing. Offenses to your religion are protected. Offenses to mine are not. If you are a genuine believer in free speech, let's get away from communalizing this.
But who's communalizing? I mean,
listen, just let me
not
finish.
The viewers, not me.
No, hang on.
No, let Pratap complete. I'll let you respond after that.
If your position is, right, that let us repeal Section 295 of IPC, no matter what the consequences, I'm actually with you. Okay?
Thank you.
Okay, this is my published position. This is not Mr. Modi ji's doing. Okay. Almost all religions also have to understand that this is going to be the nature of the modern world. That often there will be rebels who will mock. Muhammad will be mocked. Shiva will be mocked. All kinds of the Guru Granth Sahib will be mocked. Right. In fact, the best way of dealing with that mocking, in fact, precisely because you censor, you actually draw more attention to that mocking and empower it, right? I'm completely with you on that legal framework. Now coming in a sense to the specific, right? Till such time as we, if you want to form an alliance on repealing that, I'll support you. It is also the case, by the way, I mean, if you've ever been to Banaras, right? I mean, what Tandav did to Shivji is nothing to what the Shiv Bhakts to Shiv. I mean, just pick up the Ramcharit, just pick up the Ramcharitmanas, right? And I say that as a devout reader, okay? The greatness of, the one aspect of the greatness of Hinduism, right, has been that the way we defined our relationship with our own gods has been more intimate precisely because we could take these liberties with them. Okay? Now, in trying to model yourself on the Muhammad paradigm, right, you are actually, in a sense, destroying what is true of your own religion.
So the truth of the religion is this, that the
make
people are
a
extremely
principled
accommodating.
argument. So the true religion is freedom. Make a principled argument that we should protect freedom of expression. But don't make a communal argument that because we don't do this for them, we shouldn't do this for this. That's the communal argument.
Thank you.
Okay, interesting interesting response, Pratap. I'm interested to know that you want Section 295 to be off the statute books.
Yeah, so I'll give
I
you,
just wonder whether it can be done though in a country like India. Is it really possible in a country like India to actually, let's say, do away with a law which says that anything which insults or defiles a religion will be, could lead to prosecution?
So let me...
Because we are a sort of society of everyone's offended sentiments out there.
No. So two things about that, right? Let me give you a very practical reason for doing it. One reason you get a lot more offensive speech is because you know it's going to be censored. Okay, this is the paradox, remember, practically why? Because now every community sees, look, if you mobilize and say something is offensive, it's a test of which communal identity you're recognizing and which you aren't. I mean, you live in Maharashtra, right? Forget Lord Shiva. Scholarly books on Shivaji no publisher will touch a book on Shivaji.
That's right.
The figure on whom most books have been banned, by the way, right, or legal points, is actually Basaveshwara in Karnataka. Even a rearranging of the agams was struck down, right? So if Dharam Karan, Kannada Sahitya Academy prize winning novel, right? The Supreme Court did not protect its protection, right? And part of it is because every community, now when it wants to say we have a community identity, says, look, let's find something offensive to us, mobilize, because then we can show. So I actually think, because look, most people don't gratuitously want to give offense. Honestly, right? Okay? Sometimes people do. But the political charge that this offense has comes from its link to communalism, and it comes from its link to this kind of politicization. So my prediction is that if you actually took it off, people, there will be an odd nutcase here and there, somebody who's gratuitous who will do it. But it won't become the politically charged issue that it is, right? Now, I agree with you. We are not prepared for it, but we have to find a new language in which to articulate individual freedom. If you get stuck in this equivalence of communities, right? The big lesson we should learn from the 1920s and 30s, the equivalence of communities, is the most insidious form of communalism you can do. Congress also tried to practice it, by the way. It thought it could run Hindu nationalism and Muslim nationalism together. Instead, what we want to say is, your individual freedom will be protected no matter which community you're of, right? Otherwise, because this equivalence, no politics can satisfy, right? And that's the nature of our discourse on free speech. You brought up Munawar Farooqi today. The trending topic was, what about Kamlesh Tiwari, right? What kind of a politics is this?
Yes.
Interesting. Professor, we talked about BJP being an election machine, and there's a template that it has followed to go from one election to another, and governance is somewhere in between. And I was intrigued, you made a comment that, look, what they did was to take a regional template and nationalized it and sort of given it the attention. And now we are seeing a reverse of what was given as a national is now being followed actively by states. Mamta, UP, Maharashtra now, examples. This is a completely different environment where instruments of state power, suppression of judiciary, threat to personal freedom or personal harm becomes a way in which I get your consent, or if nothing else, I coerce you into silence. Is this going to be the way we are going to see governance in the future?
So, I just want to put a little caveat on this thing about BJP being an electoral machine. Of course it is, right? I mean, and quite a brilliant one at that. But the one thing we should not forget is both behind Mr. Modi and behind the BJP, there is also a big social movement. In fact, the BJP's biggest advantage is that it has a plethora of organizations that do not work on the electoral cycle. Right? The RSS's 100th anniversary is coming up. These are organizations that are playing a very long game of cultural transformation of our sensibilities. In some areas, they've actually genuinely exploited good opportunities in education, for example, Bengal, Northeast, right? And the kind of moment that the BJP represents does not happen in the vacuum, in a social vacuum. The problem, in a sense, with any non-BJP force right now is that there is actually nobody playing to the non-electoral cycle. This was, by the way, true of the US right as well. The Tea Party was not thinking next election. The Tea Party was thinking 25 years down the line, right? What do we do, okay? And I think if we are to combat this sort of misgovernance authoritarianism that you're talking about, you will have to think of, in a sense, what's that equivalent cultural work. The Congress did it in the national movement. I mean, you can agree, disagree, but what it did was it created a new and different culture, right? Right now, there is only one political side that has the organizational capability, commitment, you might say even selflessness at one level, to be able, which is why we are losing the battle. That battle is not, I mean, look, elections will come and go. Even if tomorrow the BJP were to lose by some miracle, right? You could actually end up in a worse situation of polarization and so forth, right? It's the lesson the US left and liberals are now learning the hard way. That once the unions disappeared, once the organizational base of the democracy of the Democrats disappeared, what were you left with? You were left with the evangelicals, the Tea Parties. You need an equivalent of that. That's a big vacuum we'll have to fill.
I think we've got time for one last question, if there is one.
I
yes,
have a
ma'am.
correction to gentlemen. Yeah, producer just takes care of like sort of finances. Producer is the guy who's like, oh, this bulb costs like 25 bucks or whatever. So, God of Solanki. Also, Veerdas or in Mirzapur Puneet Mishra, they made ample jokes on Hinduism and Islam alike. So, I don't know where you're getting your facts. My question first to Rajdeep is that what we saw in US after 2016 election was that almost entire media sort of came to the last resort of democracy. The media took the role that now it's on us in this whole like sort of campaign of misinformation. And you can almost say that the campaign was fueled by very proper planning, like a massive troll army coming from wherever, which is very similar to what you see in India. If you see Jai Shri Ram tweets, like, trending in the morning, it's not real people. There are 17 million Indians on Twitter, and they are not people who type in Hindi. So it is a very organized sort of structure of the troll army. Where is Indian media? Because what my mother or my father consume, who are what Professor had mentioned, it's almost the top 5 to 10% Indian upper class, which is actually really Hinduist. It would not go out and do any sort of crimes. It's not the real mob that you say, but it is quite supportive, and it does believe in a weird supremacy. It is filled in all of the IAS ranks. If you go to large extent of judiciary also, which is very Brahminical, I think 80 or something % of judiciary is Brahmins. It is also like a mild Hinduist people who believe that...
Your question?
So my question is, where is the media in sort of portraying and putting a last resort to it? Like, we lost the battle in 2019 because we don't have a media.
today we had to ask the questions to Professor. I find it extremely difficult to defend my own tribe, to be very honest. And it's a question that I think requires a sort of longer sort of discussion, because I think there's a deeper structural crisis of the Indian media in terms of its ownership, in terms of its relationship with government, and all of which creates a crisis of content, which in turn is created by a crisis of commerce. So I think there are deeper structural issues which the Indian media confronts, and I actually think it's going to get worse before it gets better.
So let me reframe a question for Professor as well.
Why don't you do that? It's easier for me not to defend my own.
Again,
I have absolutely no desire to defend the kind of media we have today.
So normally what happens is there's a power, there are lots of centers of power which compete to each other, which you were alluding in the beginning. In the US also you had a capital center which sort of came against the, Trump economy, Trumpism. Where is the capital providers or the billionaires and millionaires and entrepreneurs and the business houses of India? Because they also do, have a certain amount of power and privilege, which if strategized and assembled together, could potentially form another sort of, balance of power essentially.
So look, I'll put on my academic hat for a second. If you look at the comparative history of democratization, social movements matter, resistance matters, but the other thing that matters is the response of elites. There's no question that those who allocate capital allocate a lot of power in a democracy. Let's not kid ourselves, right? Unfortunately, I don't want to say has Indian capital turned Hindutva, maybe some have, maybe some haven't. But what Indian capital has certainly convinced itself of is that unless there is a kind of strong person of order at the center, somehow economic progress will not take place. Forgetting all kind of recent Indian history, right? When did you get high growth rates, not growth rates? This is not about the facts, right? And so at this moment, Indian capital is quite comfortable, even if not for Hindutva reasons, for in a sense, quote unquote, the reasons of order, right? To, in a sense, repress. Okay? The second thing that is happening, with capital, as you know, India is entering a period of greater concentration of capital, right? Part of it is because those regional configurations of capital are beginning to sort of break down, and why, in a strange way, Maharashtra was important, right?
Or Andhra Pradesh was important.
Or Andhra Pradesh was important, right? And one of the things about the top echelons of capital is that they also want to play the nationalist card, right? To, in a sense, secure their power. So, we are now convinced that, we'll make Mr. Ambani and Adani kind of, global powerhouses. Why can't we have our own Jack Ma and et cetera, et cetera? Simple truth is, question to ask is, why are we looking at only the non-tradable sectors, which is where you need the government the most, right? Make something that makes you a global power, right? So their internal incentives are very much aligned to at least a soft form of authoritarianism, right? Which has convinced itself, that the reason India did not grow is because there's too much fragmentation of power, too much negotiation, all of that stuff, right? And which is why you're not getting, politically you're not getting, right? The kinds of support. In the old days, capital used to hedge bets. It's hedging it much less. Of course, it doesn't help that parties are not proving themselves to be worthy of hedging. But the media thing is exactly right? Why isn't there a kind of anti-Rajiv Chandrasekhar? In a big country like India, there must be somebody, right? Because it's it's convinced us that it'll need that authoritarian state. That's the only way capital can flourish.
I think that's, we've almost reached 9 p.m. and we've gone on for an hour and a half. It's been fascinating listening to Professor Mehta, because every time Pratap speaks, I just wonder, how is it that both he and I went to Oxford and he got all the intellect and I just became a basic reporter and chronicler of what's happening around us. But he's been outstanding as ever. And I think, in a sense, provides us a nuanced, complex argument to what is happening. One of the dangers is we live in a black and white world at the moment. Are you with us or with them? Are you anti-Modi or pro-Modi? And it can go on and on. And I think that, in a sense, prevents a true samvad or a dialogue. I think one of the great characteristics of India is the notion of samvad. You can sit by the banks of the Ganga and Banaras and listen to two alternate viewpoints without necessarily being enemies of each other. And I think that's the spirit of dialogue and eventually, hopefully, reconciliation that we need to build towards. Because I think that's what makes India such a distinctive, plural society, unique in several respects. And one of the things I think that India is, that, the blind belief in authority is the greatest enemy of the truth. Indians have always been skeptics over the years, in a sense. And I hope that we return to that spirit of skepticism rather than the spirit of bhakti. Because as the great Ambedkar said, bhakti will destroy both the devotee as well as the individual who is being hero worshipped. And I think, therefore, you need the spirit of dissent without the fear of being put in jail and accused of sedition. I mean, sedition was a law which was designed to put the likes of Gandhi in jail by the colonial rulers. And today we are descending to putting stand-up comedians in jail. And I just hope that civil society protests more. You, the elites, have to protest, in my view. You have to stand up for the stand-up comedian. And if you don't, and if we don't, sadly there will be more such instances where the state will continue to misuse its powers. I think that's a sobering note on which to end today. It's again been wonderful to be in conversation with you, Pratap. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Rajdeep and Pratap. Thank you. Thank you.